Director of the USGBC, which is the United States Green Building Council. And he has done a lot of work with the city of Boston and the Green Ribbon Commission, and I think has a lot that Brookline should learn about. And finally, wrapping it up is Tom Brady, our own Tom Brady, who's a conservation administrator and is going to talk about a lot of things that the town is already implementing to deal with some of the storm-related issues that we have. So with that, I'm going to I apologize for the yellowness of this, and the lighting in here is not ideal, but hopefully things will be normal.
Thank you, Deborah. So once again, I'm Martin Pillsbury. I'm the Director of Environmental Planning at the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. For those of you who don't know who MAPC is, we're your friendly neighborhood regional planning council, which covers the greater Boston area and works with municipalities like Brookline and 100 other communities, 101 total, around the greater Boston area on a wide range of urban planning and regional planning issues. And my area is in the environmental planning, but we also have transportation, economic development, housing, open space, land use, zoning, many, many other things that we work on as well. We have at MAPC for the last couple of years been working towards developing a regional climate change adaptation strategy. The idea behind this is to help our member communities get started with thinking about and working on adaptation in their communities. We know a few communities have already begun some very robust work in Boston, Cambridge, and even some here in Brookline. Out of the 101 communities across our region, however, there's many communities that haven't really made much of a start with this yet. So what we wanted to do as the regional planning agency to help our communities is to put together some information that gives a broad regional overview of the issue and points to some directions that individual communities can go in and approaches they can take to help deal with climate change adaptation in their communities. So as an overview, this is what the presentation I'm going to talk about tonight, the major parts. What are the recent climate trends that we're looking at? What are some of the predicted future climate change trends in the future? A little bit about vulnerability, how we think about vulnerability by different sectors of society. And then some examples of adaptation approaches that we can look at the regional scale and then bring down to the local communities. So let's begin by climate change, which, the caption here, obviously, already happening. I think a few years ago, people always thought about climate change as, yes, that's a future issue. There's always projections to the year 2100, and eventually we're going to have climate change. Folks, I probably don't have to say it to this room, but we already have climate change. It's been an ongoing process. It's just a matter of how much it accelerates and how much it changes in the future. But even if you want to just look at empirical evidence on what's happened in the past up until today, first, before we think about future projections, sea level in the Boston area, according to the Boston Harbor tide gauges, has risen nearly a foot since 1920. Annual temperatures across the Northeast have warmed about 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970. I think I'm looking around the room. That's within most of our lifetimes in this room, most people. Extreme storms are becoming more frequent. We very carefully timed the session tonight to be during a week in which that would be very obvious. And extreme heat in the summer is becoming more frequent. Let's look at a few trends. This is the tidal gauges for the Boston Harbor sea levels going back to 1920. If you can see, the line goes back to 1900, but the data begins in 1920 and up to the time up to 2010, actually. And the trend line is there clearly an upward grade, and it's been a little over 10 inches over that period, 1920 to 2010, which is a 90-year period. So this is, you don't have to debate. This is not a computer projection. This is measured reality of what we've actually had for the last 90 years. Now, if we look projecting ahead, and there are many different projections, and as you know, they're based on computer models and everything, and you don't ever go and hang your hat on any one of these and say they're the absolute truth. But there's a series of different models that have been done with different methodologies and assumptions, and this arrays them together, and this is from the International Panel last report, not actually from the most recent one that just came out a couple months ago. And its projection from the year 2000 to the year 2021 for sea level rise. And you can see there are some differences, but they're all pointing in the same direction, towards an acceleration of sea level rise over this century, and ending up with somewhere between a third to a half a meter at the end of the century. And there are other projections out there that are more robust than this. These are now considered kind of on the conservative end, and so this is the kind of thing that we start to need to be playing. Many of you have probably seen this map, although it doesn't show up very well in this projector. But this is an analysis that was done for Boston Harbor, that says, what if we had sea level rise, and then on top of that, a few different scenarios for storm surges, like the kind of thing that happened with Hurricane Sandy in New York and New Jersey. A storm surge on top of an elevated sea level rise, which areas of Boston would be flooded? And there's a pretty familiar map there. You see very, very vast areas of Boston, South Boston, the Back Bay, over even dangers on the other side of the Charles, because in some of these scenarios, the Charles River Dam would actually be breached. Yeah, that helps a little bit, doesn't it? So this could be a worst-case scenario, but it is a scenario that's not completely out of the question with future sea level rise and future severe storms. And it's just to sort of lay down the outlines of some of the worst-case scenarios that we might have to be thinking about in really the not-too-distant future. A few other things to think about. It's not just about the sea, because obviously we're not all right on the sea. Brookline is not right on the sea. Close by, but not right on it. Extreme storm frequencies. So this bears on our freshwater, our floodplains, for the rivers, streams, etc. And the trends have been that we've been having more frequent extreme storm events in many places, but there's a real cluster, you can see from this map, around the northeastern New England and the northeastern part of the United States. The larger dots show an increase in frequency of extreme storms in the period 1948 to 2011. And again, that's not really that long a period of time to see a measurable change in the behavior of our storm patterns. Another way of looking at it is this little table to the right. Without getting too technical, you've probably heard the term the 100-year storm. It's kind of a benchmark, high-level storm that often is a standard that often gets put into zoning and building codes and defining where the floodplain is. And how much rain comes down in one of these 100-year storms. By the way, 100-year storm is a bit of a misnomer. What it really means is a storm the magnitude of which has a 1% chance of occurring in any 1 year. Kind of why they call it 100-year, but it's a 1% storm. The standard, traditional method, this first part of the table, TP40, stands for Technical Paper 40, that was put together some years ago, that based on hydrologic record from 1930 to 1960 says that for Boston, the 100-year storm will give us 6.6 inches of rain. But what's wrong with this picture? One thing, the hydrologic record cuts off at 1960. The last time I looked, there's been a few decades since then. Cornell has this Center for Climate that has put together a much more recent estimation based on bringing the record up to 2008, and based on updating that record. So again, this is a change in our lifetime. That 100-year storm under those calculations would be 8.8 inches compared to 6.6. So a significant amount of more water that would have to be dealt with in an extreme rainfall event. And unfortunately, we've had a few of these 100-year storms. We've had probably more than one 100-year storm in the last few decades. Another thing to think about, when climate change was first getting into the public view, it was often talked about as global warming, and that's kind of part of the picture. It's one of the underlying things is that average temperatures are going up across the globe, but we also know that it also means changes in patterns, so it's not just about warming alone. But warming is still part of it, very much so. And these graphics come from the Union of Concerned Scientists publication a few years ago that estimated from some projections for future temperature extremes in the Boston area, going out from the measured amounts in 1961 to 90 there first, and then in several decade increments. You can see the days of the year, the number of days per year over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And they're showing two different scenarios here in the yellow and the red. They're showing the yellow is a slightly more moderate scenario where greenhouse gas emissions are controlled a little bit more. And the red is our worst case scenario where greenhouse gas emissions are like the map that they put together on the right side. It's as if Massachusetts, in these different time periods, was actually more like the climate that's around, say, Maryland or Virginia under the mid-century, and under the worst-case scenario, by the end of the century, it's as if the climate here would be like South Carolina. So that's just, you know, if the numbers don't speak to you, maybe the map would. So what this actually means. And if you can imagine that we would be like South Carolina, just imagine what South Carolina would be like in that time period, and the rest of the country as well. So those are some of the underlying trends, and I'm sure that most folks in this room were well aware of what they were, and maybe you could see some of this information. But we wanted to just sort of lay out the challenges here at the regional level. But the next thing to really think about is, okay, so if we're having all of these changes in our temperature, our rainfall, our sea level, et cetera, what are our vulnerabilities as a society? And one way to think about vulnerability is to kind of look at this little flow chart where it says, what are we being exposed to? And what's the sensitivity? So the exposure would be we're being exposed to higher temperatures, or we're being exposed to more frequent flooding. And what's the sensitivity of the areas that are being affected by that? The two of those combined give you the potential impact. But that's a potential impact. If you have some adaptive capacity that may moderate that impact and mitigate it, then the ultimate result of that is what our actual vulnerability is. So that's one way, just schematically, very generally, to think about it. But to be more specific about the kinds of vulnerability, what our regional climate change adaptation strategy did was to sort of break the vulnerability analysis down into these 5 different segments. The kinds of impacts that climate change can have on human health and welfare, on the coastal zone, on natural resources and habitat, on the built environment and key infrastructure, and on the local economy and government. And I have just 1 or 2 slides for each of these to give you a very brief summary. So, human health and welfare, and Alan will be talking in more detail about this, but we can talk about heat-related impacts, morbidity, mortality, the greater chance for vector-borne diseases, with more heat and the spread of these insects that bear those, higher ozone and pollen, and greater asthma impacts, etc. That's from the heat. Algal blooms, for instance, in the water, and actually we've seen some more of those already recently in some places, both in freshwater and coastally. And frequency of waterborne diseases. So these are some of the vulnerabilities at a very high level, and Alan will be talking a little bit more detail about some of those. The other thing we need to really think about is that the population across our region as a whole and within our community is not equally vulnerable to all of these. Some parts of the population are more vulnerable to some of these impacts than others. This is a map of the 101 communities in our metropolitan region that my planning agency works for. And you can see Brookline and Boston there right here in the center of the map, and you can get an idea for the extent of our region. And this is just a map that shows some statistics on youth asthma hospitalizations from 04 to 08, just to give you an idea that if you're getting this heat impact and pollen and all of that, and it actually exacerbates this kind of a problem with asthma, which has already been a trend that we've been struggling with across society as a whole. Coastal zone impacts, one of the other categories I mentioned, and you know, a lot of our coast. This is an example of a section of the South Shore. So Brookline doesn't have this direct kind of an impact, but it gives you an idea that we have a lot of armored coastal areas, and you probably saw some of the news articles and pictures of our school assisted with just from the storms last week of those kind of areas coming under great impacts. Natural resources and habitat changes. We're looking at changing in the species composition of trees and other biota as you get warmer and different climate patterns. Offshore, we're looking at changing migratory patterns of lobster and cod shifting northward. Insect and tree diseases flourishing more than they might have in the past. Our infrastructure, perhaps our stormwater infrastructure, is the greatest, one of the greatest part of our infrastructure that's vulnerable to impacts. This is just an example in the town of Littleton of a collapsed culvert due to some high rainfall events. The local economy and government, you know, a lot of our economic activities are related to the ecosystem services, agriculture, fishing, forestry, recreation, and tourism. So as those are impacted, those activities are impacted. Government is impacted by its need for more preparedness and planning, and it strains government resources to deal with the various aspects. So adaptation, and we talked about this a minute ago, and mitigation are sort of like the two-pronged pieces of that we need to deal with. And in fact, when you think about it, there's actually, they've often been thought about as two sort of separate things, but there's certain things that kind of overlap. And there are some things like looking at green infrastructure, water, energy, the things you see in the middle here, they actually can serve both purposes. But then there's lots of other pieces here on the left side that are more in the adaptation column, and others on the more mitigation. But we really need to be thinking about this whole spectrum and about how these different measures can reinforce each other and how we can find some better, and I said stop, okay. Can I have like 3 more slides? Okay, so I just want to say that for adaptation, you know, there's a kind of a 3-part strategy that's possible to be thinking about: protecting the existing development that's coming under threat, and that often means changing the way we build, elevating buildings, and that sort of accommodating, and then in the word that no one really wants to talk about, but in some cases, areas that are just repetitively damaged, we may need to be thinking longer term about retreating from certain areas, especially along the coastline. There's a lot of measures communities can be thinking about, things they do already in some ways or the other that can be repurposed for climate mitigation, thinking about your open space planning, regulation changes for design review and for zoning, etc. A lot of these pieces MATC is beginning to work with some of our communities on, just looking at obvious things like, you know, freeboards or raising buildings near flooded areas. Integrated water management. Water is central to so much of what we're talking about here, and looking at water conservation, water reuse, looking at riparian river restoration. I'm sure that the Muddy River issue is a good example of that. We'll hear more about that from Tom and others. And green infrastructure in general, low impact development, approaches to development and redevelopment will help us with resilience. Integrating green infrastructure into our urban landscape. And this is a view of a plan from the city of Philadelphia, which is going big time in taking on the challenge of greening the city over the next 2 decades. And it's a long-term process. You're not going to do this overnight, but you have to start somewhere, and you have to change the trajectory of where we've been doing. We've had, you know, decades of building hardscapes, decades of building the old way. We have to start that process and incrementally work towards it. So the last piece is to look at transferable development rights. That's a very specific zoning technique that might be useful in some cases to move development out of more hazardous areas and into areas that are less hazardous. So that's my contact information. Sorry to be about 3 minutes over, but I wanted to try to get all of that in there, and we'll have time to discuss any questions after the other speakers.
Don't fret, Martin. I'm going to give you 3 of my minutes. So I'm Alan Balsam. I'm the Director of Public Health and Human Services here in Brookline. And I wanted to focus, not surprisingly, on the public health impacts of climate change, what we're trying to do to address it, and also address the resiliency issue, because I do think that that's critically important. So as Martin alluded to, there are really quite a number of impacts of climate change on public health. The idea of vector-borne disease was brought up. So, for example, in parts of Africa, malaria, which is a terrible disease that kills thousands or millions of people every year. We don't see it around here, but it's just a terrible disease, is spreading because the range of the mosquito is increasing. Around here, we have West Nile virus, which is basically endemic throughout the United States. But perhaps even more importantly, we now have I'm from Miami, and in Miami we now have, I think, 50 cases of dengue that are indigenous to South Florida. That's never been the case before. And chikungunya, which has now appeared. We actually had a couple of cases here that were imported to Brookline. We haven't had any indigenous cases, but there have been in South Florida, those cases. And so vector-borne disease is a serious issue, and it's one that is happening right now that we need to address. There's also the issue of heat that was brought up, and you may recall a few years ago there was a terrible heat wave in Chicago where hundreds of people died, mostly older adults. In Paris a decade ago there was another heat wave where thousands of people died. So heat is a definite issue, and particularly in urban areas where the infrastructure is such that there's not widespread air conditioning, and where people live in high rises and stuff like that. So this is something that we're very concerned about, and I'll talk in a few minutes about ways that we're trying to prepare for the increase in heat-related incidents. Obviously, there's an increase in killer storms. You know, we've had storms here, maybe they haven't been killer storms, although a few of them have, but throughout the world. I remember a couple of years ago in Bangladesh, and then there was the tsunami. The thing about these killer storms is they're bad enough because they kill large numbers of people and displace many others. But the issue of floods and population displacement have all kinds of other effects. It affects people's ability to get water. So if you don't have clean water, then there's all kinds of diseases that present as a result of that. Kind of the classic example is after the earthquake in Haiti, where waterborne disease escalated out of sight, and it's still a huge issue down there even today. You have population displacement, as I've said, inability to secure food, cholera, other diseases, and then social unrest. People can't get food, they can't get water, they have no place to go. That leads to tremendous conflict, and it might be a stretch to say that social unrest is a public health issue, but certainly violence is, and violence often comes after these kinds of events, because people don't have what they need. The increase in particulates was mentioned. In almost every variable that you look at, Brookline does very well. Our longevity is 87 years compared to Cambridge, which has longevity of 82 years, which makes me think about moving to Brookline. I might live 6 years longer if I come over here. You know, in almost every parameter, Brookline does well. Our rates are lower, with the exception maybe of certain cancers, because we have very good screening among our population. But that's not true for asthma. The rate of asthma among kids in Brookline is 10%, which is the same as the state average. And so that is concerning to all of us. And so obviously with the increase in particulates, that would probably lead to increased rates of asthma, and something that we need to be concerned about. So what is public health involved in? We're trying to educate people and convince people to lower their carbon footprint. Alternate energy is, of course, the first thing that comes to mind, and as you all know, the Department of Public Health and the Friends of Brookline Public Health took this very seriously when we renovated our buildings 7 years ago and created the first green building in Brookline. And when we chose to put those voltaic panels up, we did so in a way that wasn't flat, but rather was oriented so that everybody in Brookline Village could see it, so that it would be something that would inspire other people to do the same. And it's actually worked. Lots of other groups have toured our building and wanted to know how we did it, and what other elements within the building constitute a green building, and so forth. So there is a trend, I think it's fair to say, toward being more responsible about those issues in Brookline today. And the fact that we have a climate week is one indication of that. One thing I'm very concerned about that may not be evident at first blush, because my background's in nutrition, is the role of food and nutrition in climate change. Many people, including my students, don't realize that one of the biggest contributors to climate change is animal husbandry. And so one thing that's very important to me is to get people to eat lower on the food chain. And the beauty of that strategy is that it not only benefits the environment by getting rid of meat and related issues, or getting people to eat less of it. But it also is good for our health, because meat's bad. It ain't good for you, man. So if you want to, make yourself a little healthier, avoid meat, among other things. So that's a message that has a double edge, which is promote better health, but also lower our carbon footprint. So for example, in the schools, we work with the school department to introduce Meatless Monday. We have a vegetarian option every day in the schools here. We have Dynamite Farmers Market, the best one in the state, I would say. We have we have a lot of different initiatives, including CSAs. There are, I think, 5 of them now operating in Brookline. So we're trying very hard to give people other options to eat healthier, to lower their risk of disease, and to lower their carbon footprint. Having said all of that, this still is the issue of resiliency that Martin talked about. And so the issue is, what are we going to do to stop the freight train, or to at least slow it down? So one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to plan for this. As you may know, Brookline has an emergency management team that I co-chair with the police and fire chief, and our group is in charge of anything that has to do with health. So, well, just as a for instance, last week we did a tabletop exercise that looked at an infectious disease outbreak at Boston University, and how the Brookline Department of Public Health and all of the related agencies would respond to such an outbreak of disease. It's not so far-fetched if you think about it, given what's going on with measles now in other places, and the fact that bird flu may reemerge, and that there's Ebola. Fortunately, we haven't had any cases here, but we have followed people who have come back from West Africa, and to make sure that we're on top of that situation. So working with the emergency management team, making sure that people know each other, have worked together well in the past, so when something hits the fan, we're not handing out business cards. We know who all the key people are, and we're used to working with them. And that includes working with Martin's group, and he's helping us work through all of the various scenarios that may present themselves as we write our resiliency plan for Brookline. I think these drills are critically important, but I think the most important thing that we've done at the Department of Public Health is to develop a medical reserve corps. We now have 200 members of the medical reserve corps. Most of them are medical types, docs, nurses, and other types of health personnel, but many of them are not. And we have trainings once a month for these folks, including members of the CERT team, the Community Emergency Response Team, that works very closely with the MRC. And this is a group that's going to back us up in case anything happens, and they already are backing us up in things like flu clinics or staffing shelters. So we go through drills, how to set up a shelter in case there's a heat wave or there's an ice storm or something else. And in the past couple of years, we've set up shelters perhaps a half a dozen times. So training our volunteers in how to do that, getting people familiar with one another so that they can hit the ground running in case something happens. So those are the issues that I think are most important. I haven't touched on all of them given the time, but maybe we can talk more about it in the question and answer. The point is that we know it's happening. There are things that the Public Health Department and public health in general can advocate for and do with regard to policy and also education. And finally, there are things we can do to mitigate the problems as they unfold. Thank you.
Back together. One of the things that in the work that we do, which I'll explain a little bit of, is so clear is the role of your community in how how resilient your life is, how resilient your community is, and things like the community health teams and CERF teams have a huge role to play in all of our health as we run into these problems. The classic situation, which we're all in the middle of right now, is shoveling the walks on your sidewalk and on your neighbor's sidewalk. My neighborhood, I live in Cambridge, and I may only live for 82 years, but we'll have a heck of a time. Is that one of the key things in our neighborhood is there's 4 or 5 people who have a view of who needs help, who's likely to be in trouble if something happens. How do you know? Have you seen everybody today? Let's make sure everybody's sidewalks get shoveled. And what about those kids those college kids down the street? Let's make sure they get their thing done. And that there's this community view of what do we have to do here to get through this situation. So I'm going to focus a little bit differently here and to sort of bring this down to what you can do and sort of your role in this process. And to think about, mostly I'll talk about buildings because most of us think about buildings in terms of resilience. But one of the great things about thinking about buildings, as Martin said, is the idea that that the things you're doing to take care of looking ahead and adapting to the changing climate, many of them are things that are going to help us from changing the climate more. And that, in the technical terms, adaptation and mitigation have a lot of things in common. In the less technical way of thinking about it, saving energy, being thoughtful with water, are things that probably help us as we move forward in adapting to what the crazy stuff that might happen. So these are sort of some ideas, but as you start to understand how this plays in your place, you got to realize that places are all very different. And the big difference between that slide, this image of sea level rise in the Seaport District, and what's going on in Devon, or what's happening in Brookline, or in different parts of Brookline. And Brookline is all very different. There's lots of different things going on. And it's also worth thinking about things that that you get more than one base out of each hit. That when you do something, you want to do things that really get you as much as you possibly can. So thinking about, is this going to help me in a heat situation? Is this going to help me in a flooding situation? Is this going to help me save energy? Is this going to help me every day? Does it help me stop emitting carbon? So you want to think about things that give you as many hits as you possibly can. So now thinking about Brookline, right? So sort of our waterways and the transit and things like that. And you start to look at, okay, well, what about flooding? Well, so, flooding isn't a huge deal in Brookline. I mean, there's low-lying areas that flood. Brookline doesn't have a ton of sort of exposure to sea level rise. If you think about, well, what are the places you can sort of see, well, those are the places where you might get some flooding, what's referred to as riverine flooding, or flooding from storms that floods the waterways, as opposed to storm surge and sea level rise flooding, which is what everybody's talking about in Boston. Probably somewhat in an overblown way. And you'll see, so the Cambridge Vulnerability Study is about to come out. Cambridge has spent a pile of money doing a bunch of really fancy modeling to figure out what are the key issues affecting Cambridge over the next 100 years. And one of the things they figured out is the sea level rise issues are not that great. What's really going to be the issue is rainstorms. And that rainstorms are going to be more often and be bigger, and that's going to overwhelm the infrastructure of the city. And so now we're talking, now this gives everybody something to focus on. And heat is going to be an issue as the city warms up.
So, and you think about this, and then you think, okay, where are the high wind zones, all right, there are high wind zones in Brookline, you know, doesn't mean that everybody's house there is exposed to high wind, but something to think about. And then you think about, okay, well, let's zero in a little bit. Those little flags are schools. So, okay, we've got some issues with schools and places that might flood. I bet everybody already knows that. You know, have heard about them, or you're dealing with them, or, but you know, okay, so that's, okay, now we've sort of set the tone. What do we got to worry about? You got houses in those places too. You live there. So now, let's think about, let's just run through a few things. We're working on one of the projects we're working on right now is a project with Enterprise Community Partners who funds affordable housing in many places around the country, not as much in the Boston area. Are doing a ton of work in New York, have done a ton of work in the New York area, and they're very interested in looking at resilience based on the experiences out of Superstorm Sandy. So in the New York world, they call it Superstorm Sandy. And if you tell people it's Hurricane Sandy in New York, they say, oh no, it was Superstorm Sandy. Whatever. And these are things that we've been working with their team to look at residential settings of various sorts, and what are the issues that pop up that you can do something about. So one of them is, there are a lot of things about water in your building. Now, this sounds sort of dumb, right? Well, keep water out of your building. Of course you do. How does water get into your building? Well, it might get in through backup from the sewer system. So you have a backflow preventer on your sewer system. Might come in from groundwater coming up and coming in through your basement. That's how it gets into my house. Lots of different ways. Think about that. What does that mean? How do you attack that? Thinking about backup power. You know, one of the big things that happens in these issues is the power goes out for a while. What happens if your power goes out for a while? What happens if it's right now? Suppose we get an ice storm. Takes down the power in your neighborhood. Totally likely. Pretty, you know, I mean, it doesn't happen a ton, but it happens. What happens if it happens in the summer and it's 95 degrees? How do you fare then? Protecting your equipment from flooding if you're in a place where there's flooding. If you're not in a place where there's flooding, that's probably not something you need to worry about. Protecting the building itself from flooding. This is the issue of green infrastructure. And I'll talk a little bit about ways you can think about green infrastructure that that you can do in your place or in the buildings that you interact with. Again, sewage backflow, and then the issues around what Alex Wilson and others have termed passive survivability. So there's this very interesting situation that when you get to especially larger buildings, like say town hall, not to zero in on town buildings, that if power goes out to that building, what happens over time? The answer is either it gets really hot or it gets really cold very quickly, depending on what time of year it is. Similarly with your house, can get very hot and very cold very quickly. How does your house do in terms of being able to be passively survivable? And this is something you can do something about. So when you think about flooding scenarios, you know, this is an analysis we did for a project in Fort Point Channel. Okay, Fort Point Channel has flooding issues, all right? No question. They don't call it the inundation district for nothing. Well, that's great, but, you know, this equipment is for real, and it's about, the transformer is about a foot above mean high water. You get any storm, that thing's underwater. The last time I happened to be there, there were sandbags around it. That beautiful electrical room is about 4 feet below mean high water. So you get some storm surge and the groundwater starts pouring into that building. It's a 100-year-old building. It's got granite foundation. There's nothing keeping that water out. And so these guys have a real problem. And there are buildings that you exist in that have similar issues, you just want to think it through. And then this issue of green infrastructure, I'm not going to jump into it too far, except I'll tell you one story of a project that we were involved in Boston. And this is the green alley at the Boston Architectural College. It's, we're looking from Hereford Street to the alley behind that BAC building and you know, the Boylston's between Newbury Street and Boylston. This project, they were digging up that alley. They spent about $300,000 doing this. Now the whole project was much more than that. There was a lot of other things going on. And on top of that $300,000 was about $100,000 that we got to monitor the effectiveness of this system, which you're not going to do on every project. But that process led to essentially 100% of the stormwater that falls on that property staying out of the storm sewers. So that means that you do a few of those, and all of a sudden, your storm sewers are carrying a lot less load under those big storm situations. And this just sort of gives you, this is a publicly available display on this project, which you can go take a look at. If you Google BAC and Green Alley, you'll find it. Just sort of tells a story about groundwater level and stuff like that. But this is something that you can think about on your own property. And your own property can be doing this to keep water both from flooding you and from flooding your neighbors. And this is something that everybody can do. We do it on our property. And then finally, to sort of think a little bit about heat and about what the issues are with heat and how to deal with this. And this is a graph of heating degree days and cooling degree days. So heating degree days are in the red. That means essentially how much heat do you use in different months that tell you, and then cooling degree days is how much cooling energy you use. And then the electricity used is the green line at the top. So it gives you a view. This is for a building that this thing, the red here is places that are hot. The green are places that are cool. It's an infrared image of that part of the city. Now, this particular example of this is a little district heating system at Princeton, I think it is. And so heat went out, electricity went out, grid went down. This is, I believe, during Sandy. Grid went down. What happened? Well, their little system took up a bunch of the slack until the grid came back. And so you want to think about, well, what are you using? What do you need? Can you drop your load through changing your building and changing shading in your house? Can you drop the electrical load to the point where what you've got can actually suffice? And can you think about shading? Can you think about passive ventilation? You know, we all think about it in our houses and opening our windows and closing our windows, but can you think about it in a more systematic way to really get what you need? And then finally, you and all of us should go through a process to say, all right, what Martin was talking about, what kind of vulnerability do we have? What are we vulnerable to? What kind of targets might we want to have? How do we proceed to try and hit those targets? And then how are we doing? Are we hitting those targets? And this is sort of a model of how you think about assessing vulnerability and risk and then devising a plan for doing it. And I just suggest we all should be doing this. We should all be thinking about it. It's not about being scared and about, oh, we're in big trouble, we got to do something now. It's about, hey, what do we want? How do we want to live? Can we live better? Can we live better using less? I bet we can. And so it's a way of developing that as a vision. So that's it for me.
So Deborah's doing the transition. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. I am Tom Brady. height, the same weight, it's distributed a little bit differently, I'll give you that. Mine is the right color. My bride is the Rosa, so I married a Portuguese lady. I'm in Brookline every day, and I haven't met the crafts. So I ask you who the other Tom Brady is. All thing.
Are you rich?
Yes, I am. So I'm here to talk about some of the things that we do in Brookline more specifically, and bring it down to the community a bit. Any one of these I could talk about for many, many hours, as some of you have been to other talks, are much too aware of. I'm the conservation administrator for Brookline. I'm also the tree warden and the town arborist. I'm an arborist by training. I've been doing conservation and stormwater work for a little over 20 years. I have a construction background as well, so I have a little bit of information on this. Oh, I'm sorry, I want to go page up. Oh, I want this page up. So that was when I had it. Here we go. Okay, some background, just some groundwork so you know. I'm happy to work here for a number of reasons, not the least of which is I think the town has an awareness of the changes that are happening. I'm certain we are. And we've taken some actions to address those. And one of those is to actually codify how people need to deal with the stormwater, both on public projects and private projects. And in the fairly recent past, we passed a new stormwater management bylaw, which means that if you do more than 2,500 square feet of disturbance or 25%, you have to follow some requirements. That includes a stormwater plan to be submitted for review and approved by the engineering division. Well, what I really like is that if the projects are greater than 1 acre in size, i.e. the one that comes to mind most recently for me, there's two. One is what was going to be considered as a church on Route 9 that was clear but didn't proceed, but with the Conservation Commission had a great deal of review on that. And the Fisher Hill project we had a great deal of review on. I'm happy about that because in the Conservation Commission there are 7 members, and I staff that commission. I provide support for them. But those 7 members have a wealth of information and background, including stormwater management, engineering, and they bring a wealth of information to the table. So now, the town requires applicants, when it rains, to store, and I also, as always, put in quotes, the 25-year storm event, which seems to happen about every 3 weeks right now. And that means they need to store it on their property and recharge it before it goes out to the storm drain system in the town. Not so long ago, everything that came in went down your driveway, hit the street, and into the catch basins, through the small laterals into the mains, and off it went. The reality is, as we've all seen it, as the storms have become more frequent, there are capacity issues with the system. There are capacity issues with all these systems. You can't construct them large enough to handle that type of volume and still actually have a functioning infrastructure that people can drive on and walk on. So we've tried to integrate the two of both the green infrastructure approaches and what I call the hard solutions with some success. We've done it in both public and private projects, and I'd like to just show you a couple examples of those. This is a good example of a private project. When the rain hits the roof up here, it comes down roof leaders, or it comes off their driveway, even the rainwater that hits the driveway gets caught in catch basins and comes around and gets fed into these large chambers. This is a recharge system. It's essentially perforated, very, very large perforated chambers surrounded by 3/4 stone. So the rain comes in, gets recharged, and you're required now to catch that 25-year storm event, put it back into the recharge for the aquifer, and frankly not to overburden the system. And then every system is allowed to have an overflow. After you hit that 25-year event, and these fill up, it then comes out, and this pipe goes all the way around the front of the building, and ends up and then ties into the system. So it's a nice combination where, yes, we're trying to do the recharge, there's also this overflow situation. Additionally, I should note, it's important to note that, yes, if you come to the engineering division and you say, and you can demonstrate, you say, hey, look, in my property, which is not uncommon in Brookline, I'm full of ledge. I literally can't go more than 6 inches down in my yard unless I blast. That doesn't make sense to do this. So there are provisions in there where if you provide compelling reasons that you can't make this happen, there are, essentially in lack of a better term, there are some outs there. Now for the public side, this, anyone have a guess what this is? Fisher Hill. Almost a mile, if you walk it literally, of underground recharge chambers. So when the kids are out here playing soccer, when this is completed, keep in your mind as you're watching your son, daughter, cousin, friend, community member play soccer, that underneath them, that's where all the stormwater is going from the site. Where you're parking, all the pathways that you're gonna see, everything goes here. Same exact thing that we just talked about. We are capturing the 25-year storm event, and then it has an overflow and goes out into the street after that. We also on the site, keep this in the back of your mind, that when you go there and it's completed, when you pull in the parking lot, you're gonna see this funny looking little thing on the side of the parking lot, looks like a ditch. And you're gonna wonder why they have a ditch. That ditch is a stormwater swale. And you're gonna see a couple of weir structures in it. So what happens is that water level fills up, so it goes over these little weir structures which control the flow, and both infiltrates there, and then treats the water before it goes to the overflow and out from the recharge. It also will be an educational component so that we can, when people say, well, what does the swale do and how does it work? We'll have some signage up there that we can say, hey, there's a great spot, you can go see it. Because if this stuff really works, a lot of times, just like here, you're never going to see it. You have no idea it's there. So, and that's what I really like about the green infrastructure a lot, is that I can't tell you over the years how many thousands of hard engineered solutions that I've permitted. And it's nice to see these types of things that will work and function. And you can see all those recharge chambers. The black fabric you see is just the largest roll of filter fabric you could possibly ever imagine. So, and so much 3/4 stone boggles the mind.
Is that a rendering or a photo?
That is a photo. That is literally what we were constructing earlier this summer. So, and you can see, if you look closely to the left, you see the engineering, the laser level. Everything is done to spec. And that's sometimes one of the other things that folks I think are surprised about, is that this notion that water will always just kind of find its way isn't actually true. You actually have to construct it. Water doesn't like to flow uphill, even if it's only 3 inches off. So everything is constructed here in an appropriate manner, which is pretty neat to see. So the Muddy River Restoration Project is a big one. I could talk about this for hours, but I won't. I'm the Muddy River Restoration Project Manager for the town of Brookline. I've been here coming up on starting my 15th year. I've been working on the projects literally since the first day I got into the office. It's progressing very well from the construction side. We have now started, the culverts are completed underneath Brookline Ave. We are now starting the culverts underneath the riverway. The bypass pumping on the lower section of the river is going to start probably in about a month and a half. Things are globally on track with the first piece of it. We are pushing for additional funding. The Corps of Engineers has said since day one that from a flood control point of view, this project is well worth the money. From an environmental point of view, this project is well worth the effort, but it's way too expensive. So we've always had to push to get that additional funding, and that push continues. So if you have any friends that are in higher places in Washington, you could use your support. We've been having that discussion for over a decade. We're going to continue to have that. Improved street designs. These are, I love these because from my point of view, again, you see them, you don't even know they're happening. Stormwater swales. So on the side of Buckminster Road, as you're driving down Buckminster Road, you pass Seaver Road and you're right, you don't even know there's a swale there. There's a 35-foot long swale next to the road. It's very discreet. And at the end of the swale, we have a catch basin. Inside the swale, we catch the water before it comes out and goes back into the roadway, so it doesn't create any adverse conditions. In the old days, we would just take that catch basin and take the water and put it right into the pipe. But now we're taking another step. That's an infiltration catch basin. So it goes into the catch basin and infiltrates out through that. And then we have an overflow in the catch basin, and when that gets full up, then it goes into the system. We also have a couple of those down in the Cogman area, and they work very well. The infiltration down in the area of Cypress and Franklin, roughly, very sandy down there, really. It's really the only place in town that's very sandy. And we have a very, very large infiltration basin. If you're driving down the street, you're walking down the street, you're going to walk right over it. Looks like every other catch basin you see in the community. But that one, 99% of the water gets recharged back and right back into the ground around it. So, and then again, we have overflow if we need it. There's a lot of changes that are taking place. We're reducing the impervious areas wherever possible. You've seen some changes take place around town in the past few years where these massive intersections that are like 50 feet from one curb to the other curb, and you could like play a soccer field in the middle of the intersection. Those are getting reduced in size, and you may notice that when they're getting reduced in size, they're getting what we call teed up for better geometry for the intersection, and sure, that's great. But then we're doing catch basins with those changes, which is good, but then we're doing these little mini infiltration swales on all the points. So we're catching that water before it goes out. We do have some green roofs, type of stuff in a couple different places. So this is, looks like it's 2 different kinds of pavement, right? But if it's dry, you can't tell the difference. This is a development that recently happened in Brookline. This is pervious asphalt, as is this, and this is regular asphalt. This is at the end of Princeton Road, there's 2 brand new houses on the end. So if you're looking at this during the daytime and it's dry, the pavement looks virtually identical. But there's a pretty heavy rainfall going on here, so, and it runs down the road, and that's the shine that you're seeing on this asphalt, and as soon as it hits the pervious, gone.
That's all private property then?
Nope, this is a public road extension. So this is a dead-end extension. So it's really, this is where our rubbish trucks and tractors are gonna go. This is the private right going here. Works very well. So, great, great, great. And I love it because we're gonna see it in everything.